Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our brand new show on Independence Live, the Media Mash. What we're hoping to do once a month is bring two or three commentators to talk about what's been in the news over the last couple of weeks. We're going to really try and give you the stories behind the headlines as well as the headlines. And I'm absolutely delighted this week we have two fantastic guests to talk about the last couple of weeks' news. Now, the first person I'd like to introduce you to is. Hi, David, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, William. Thanks for having me on.
Nope, we're really excited to have your insight, and we also have Jackie Kemp. Hello, Jackie.
Hi, nice to be on the show.
Well, thanks very much for joining us. We've got 10 news items we're going to talk through tonight. And what I'd also like to do is ask any of the viewers to let us know about the stories that have really resonated with them over the last couple of weeks. And also, I'd love to have your comments and your insights into the stories as we discuss them. Now, the first and the biggest story of the last few days is obviously what's happened in Westminster with the parties that weren't quite parties or didn't exist, and it's been an incredible kind of 48 hours for news watchers. I just wonder if we could just briefly start on that before we go through the stories. Jackie, what's your thoughts on the last 48 hours?
For me, I think the most important thing is lying. Did Boris Johnson lie to Parliament? Because it seems to me that he did, and he's lied repeatedly to Parliament, and there isn't really any sanction. I was looking up what is the penalty for lying to Parliament, and really it's to do with the ministerial code. Did the minister or the prime minister break the ministerial code? But even that, because Priti Patel broke the ministerial code, she bullied her staff. She didn't resign, so there's really no sanction other than public embarrassment. I mean, I find Boris Johnson quite scary because I think he's a psychopath. I don't think he feels any shame or compunction about lying. He does it so often, and so I just wonder, it is kind of British democracy quite defenseless,
Mm.
really, in the face of people who don't obey the conventions.
And David, what's your thoughts? I thought I have to agree with you, Jackie. He is a public embarrassment. That's for sure. David, your thoughts on the last 48 hours?
First of all, I would say I completely agree with what Jackie said in terms of the sort of psychopathic nature of Boris Johnson. And whilst I might not use the exact same term, his conduct, not just the last couple of days, but over several scandals over recent weeks and months, or more or less the entirety of his premiership, really. Um, is it seems to be repeated failure or repeated incompetence, which never gets called out on any sort of general level. And that's largely one thing is because we've got such a centre right media that they give him a much easier run than he probably should have. But another thing, and I think this more speaks to what Jackie mentioned, is it's another indication of the double standards which the Tory party seem to think that they are quite entitled to get away with. Even though I was in South Africa last year, I was told by many people back here how stringent and how hard the lockdown was, especially in the winter months. And now the fact that it's coming to light that probably on several occasions, let alone just one, the Conservatives and members of government sort of flouted these laws just because they fancied having a party and they thought these things don't apply to them. And that is the more worrying thing, because where does that line stop where you think that the law doesn't really apply to a certain group of people?
Okay,
Yeah,
fantastic. Yeah, well, I think that's a good. I think that's a good introduction to the stories that we've got now tonight. We've got some Scottish stories, some UK stories, and some international stories. And the first one I wanted to start with, David, was one that you forwarded to us, and this was about the German election. Do you want to talk us through why you chose this and what you'd like to highlight from it?
Well, it was more I thought it was worth highlighting, not because the German elections in themselves are particularly important or will have any particular ramifications in the short term. But the reason I wanted to bring up is because this is, well, evidently the end of a political era, not just in Germany, but also for wider Europe, with the transition away from Angela Merkel. And whether people like her or hate her, she has been a sort of important and influential voice on the world stage, particularly in European politics for several years now. But I did think it was rather unfortunate the fact that in the last week of when she was still in power, that Germany brought in these very wide-ranging COVID restrictions, which some of which, without pressing the point too thoroughly, some of them had some historical echoes which made me incredibly uncomfortable. And the fact that one of her last things was to essentially put in a form of apartheid in terms of people's vaccination status in Germany, that had historical echoes which sat uneasily with me. But the fact that she said that it was for the purposes of national unity, especially, is that yeah that I think that might have marred her final days.
Well, I mean, there are lots of things I'm sure that Angela Merkel has got wrong, but in terms of her overall, um, you know, trajectory, like originally she opposed gay marriage, but then she later changed her mind on that. I guess she was on a journey on that lots of people were on. Um, so there are you can look at Angela Merkel's record and pick certain things out. But in terms of her, her overall, her sort of humanity with letting the Syrian refugees come to Germany, and her morality, I think, I feel she was a real rock. She was very stable, very calm. It's so important that German democracy is strong, particularly in a world where British democracy seems to be kind of undergoing some horrible transition.
Mm.
Uh, I think it is important, and I hope that her legacy is carried on by the coalition, which I hope will be one that achieves some advances in green policies and so on.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think it's interesting that we've got a German cabinet with the majority of them who weren't so are going to be so constrained by this idea of inflation, which is hugely influential in economic terms. People who lived through who lived through the 1970s have always got this real resistance to anything that causes inflation. And I think the German government now are going to be very different in terms of fiscal deficits and being able to spend a little bit more in areas within the German economy. And what happens in Germany obviously dictates what happens in the European Union. So you're right. I think it's a definite transformational change that's happening in Germany, and it will have a big influence on Europe and the United Kingdom. Okay, next up, David, I think you've got another international story for us here. Afghanistan.
Yeah, Afghanistan, unfortunately, is. But again, it was one that I thought had to be brought up for two reasons. One, it shows that several of the concerns and worries that people had about what would happen post the transition to Taliban rule. Again, a lot of them are coming to pass, and there's no reason to think any more hopefully about this. But from a wider perspective, the reason I wanted to bring it up is to my mind is this is all you really the only real engagement you'll get with Afghanistan now, if any, is you might get a trickle of stories which will come out, and 9 times out of 10 it'll be like, look how awful Taliban rule is. But considering our own role in what happened to that country, the changes, the hopes and aspirations that people put in the coalition forces, you could argue that the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the manner in which it happened could be one of the defining catastrophes of not just Britain's recent history, but also in the United States, of course. And the reason I wanted to sort of bring it up is it gives that idea that essentially what was any of that for if absolutely nothing in that country has changed. And I can understand why a lot of people, a lot of citizens are very angry about how all of that went.
And Jackie, how do you think Afghanistan and withdrawal for Afghanistan has been covered in the mainstream media in the UK? Do you think it's been glossed over, or do you think there's been an element of, certainly, has there been any depth that's looked into what happened before the evacuation in Afghanistan?
Oh, the stuff that's been coming out recently, actually, I have a lot of respect for Helena Kennedy, and she's done an awful lot to get some women out of Afghanistan, some lawyers and judges and prosecutors and things. And she was on Radio in Scotland the other day. They had her on to sort of congratulate her about winning some kind of award, like the most influential woman of the year or something. And she was like, I don't want to talk about the award. I want to talk about the fact that I've got like 150 female lawyers sitting in some harbour in Greece, and the UK government won't help to bring them into the UK. You know, my charity, my crowdfunding charity, is trying to like pay for them to eat and sleep. And you know, there are a lot of people like her who are trying to get people out. I was reading something in the New York Times about some farmhouse in Virginia, which is full of people who are basically trying to actually individually get people out. And there are Afghans who work with the British who found their way to Calais, and there's no legal routes for them to come over. So they, if they ever were to reach British soil under Priti Patel's new legislation, they would be, you know, immediately criminalized.
Mm.
It's awful. It's a mess. And the stuff that came out at the weekend about Dominic Raab's, you know, his team, how they put one guy on to open the emails and say that so that Boris Johnson could say that they'd been read, even though they hadn't been processed in any way. So they were going to have to be reread in order to act on them. You know, thousands of people who, you know, had reason to expect some help. In fact, there was a guy I heard on another show. There's a guy who I think it was like a special forces British guy, worked for a charity, and he'd gone to the border with 40 women who worked for his organization, and he'd been told that he was going to get help, but something screwed up in London and there was no help, so they were sitting at the border for so long that they got taken by the Taliban. You know, it's like it was awful. It was awful, and I think it's going to take years for the whole mess to be really, the extent of it even to be understood.
Yeah, I think
And
there's
now
huge
people are starting.
variety of different stories as well. For me, the important thing that I picked up was the lack of context to what happened in Afghanistan. And I think it was only if you were lucky if they went back to the invasion of Afghanistan in terms of the context, but actually going right back to the formation of Afghanistan and the role of the West in Afghanistan seemed to be something that was completely missed out. Jackie, I'm going to call up one of yours now. And we've got, I suppose, linking nicely into the idea of refugees. We've got this from the FT, I believe, net migration of EU nationals.
Yeah, that's just it's just showing that over the last year, uh, you know, it's proof that I think lots of people in Scotland are already aware that uh, that we're losing our EU citizens. Lots of them are going. Uh, you know, last year, 94,000 more EU nationals left the UK than arrived. So that's just a real turnaround, and that's devastating for Scotland because, you know, we have an aging population. We have a lot of rural areas where good businesses are having to shut their doors because they don't have the staff. So that's impacting the Scottish economy, the care sector.
Mhm.
You know, it's devastating for Scotland. And
Absolutely.
although Nicola Sturgeon has done her best to tell EU nationals that they're still welcome here, that's not really cutting through to the extent you know, that we would have wanted. You know, I think it's a shame. A shame.
Yeah.
We're going to miss them. You know.
David, how do you feel the coverage of migration in Scotland is covered? Because it very much seems to be, again, the prism that we look at this is the UK and immigration to the UK. Do you think there's enough of a focus on how net migration affects the Scottish economy and I suppose Scottish culture and Scotland as a whole, or do you think there is this kind of central focus on the UK?
Well, it's a really interesting question, William. Is from my experience with, and I'm predominantly drawing on either anecdotal evidence recently or from looking at this quite in depth in my own research. When it comes to uh, immigration, particularly the European immigration, the lead for most newspapers is really taken by the UK office. So even the likes of the Scottish Daily Mail or like the Scottish Daily Express or the Times, etc., the Scottish editions of all these, they always generally follow what the pattern is in England. The more interesting one, or the more interesting examples are probably the likes of the Herald or the Scotsman, or sometimes the likes of the Daily Record or even the Scottish Sun, is the ones that have got a predominantly Scottish audience, will draw out these aspects of how migration patterns or migration trends might impact specifically the Scottish economy. But that again, that's generally restricted to the Scottish titles and particularly the broadsheets. If you're looking at the likes of the Daily Mail or the Express, well, 90% of people know exactly what their opinion on migration is, and also what their opinion on Scotland's prospects are. So that because of that, it's the Scottish aspect does get discussed, but as you alluded to, it's usually framed purely in like a UK context, which by no way captures any of the nuances to which, for example, yourself and Jackie have alluded.
Yeah.
Jackie, just picking up there on the kind of personal stories, is there a personal story that you've come across that is an example of what's happening in Scotland and the wider impact that that's having?
Yes, I mean I have Polish friends, and last time they had to go home for a funeral, and when they came back, they got all these questions about, so you're going back? How can you be going back to the UK? You're not entitled, and they've lived here for 15, 20 years. And my friend's husband was really angry about having to get all these questions, and I think there isn't, as I understand it, there isn't a paper document that proves you've got settled status. So you can get kind of nasty questions from the border people, and it just pisses people off, really. And then I was in a hotel. I do a newsletter, and I did one about Highland hospitality. I was up in the Highlands, and I was driving around speaking to hotel waiters, and they're on their knees because they had such a tough season because they didn't have enough staff, most of the hotels. But they were just saying that drawing on this pool of people with settled status, that's not really a long term solution because it's going to diminish every year. I spoke to a farmer who had to plough in fields full of crops because they didn't have enough workers.
Mm.
And I know people who have that experience. You walk through the countryside, you see the sheep in eating perfectly good cabbages, and you're like, why is that happening? It's happening because there aren't enough workers.
Yeah, I think most people who are in Scotland have got one of those stories. The important economic point I'd pick up on that Scotland's a small country and it
Mm.
needs people. And it needs people to do stuff, and it also needs people to buy stuff. And migration is hugely important for Scotland. And when we see anything that's reducing the population of Scotland, it's reducing our strength as an economy. And that's something, again, I think is completely missed from the coverage of migration. It's absolutely essential for the people themselves and
I
also for our
think people
economy as a wider.
the sort of the paradigm is that there's like a cake. There's a certain number of slices of cake, and the amount of people that are here, they can sort of divide this cake so that if there's more people, I mean, if there's fewer people, you get more cake. But actually, the size of the economy, it depends partly on how many active people there are doing stuff. Like the example of a hotel that has to shut on 3 days a week, or a shop that can't open, those sorts of things. So that business doesn't happen then. It doesn't, so the cake gets smaller. I think that's what people don't understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, next one was again another one of yours, Jackie. Do you want to talk us through this one?
Which one is?
So
I can't
Sturgeon
see.
is being forced to play the long game on a second
Oh
referendum,
yeah.
and that again, I
Well,
think
that's
that was from
that.
the FT as well.
No, that is from the Guardian actually. That's Martin Kettle. Um, yeah. So I thought that piece was interesting because it was kind of saying that Boris Johnson and the UK government's plan is just to kind of wait it out, wait and see, and Nicola Sturgeon is going to be sort of checkmated by that. But I think it seemed to see Scottish independence as being, this alien sort of surge of nationalism, and the piece, and I find this is quite consistent with a lot of the point of view of the Labour Party, the UK government. It doesn't really take account of the underlying issues. Some of the things that are pushing for independence aren't some kind of just random surge of nationalism. They are things like Brexit. They are things like the House of Lords. Lots of people in Scotland resent the fact that the Scottish Office Minister is Malcolm Offord, who's a Tory party donor, who failed to win election in a democratic contest and then was then given a title. These are sores.
Mm.
They're wounds, and the things like I don't think when people in Scotland, I think they. I don't know if it's cultural, but I don't think we really get Boris Johnson. It's almost like if you were going to draw some kind of stereotype of an Englishman, you might come up with Boris Johnson, and it just doesn't. He just doesn't play well up here. I think people are perplexed by why he gets so many votes.
Yeah, I, I am perplexed. David, do you think the view of Scottish independence has changed since 2013, 2014, or do you still think that Martin's view as preceded by Jackie there is still the dominant feeling of the UK media, that it's still about this kind of tartan shortbread Scottish independence, and they can't quite see the underlying reasons for the demand for Scottish independence?
I think certainly journalists from the wider UK and particularly from the London media bubble is there have been a handful of exceptions over the years since 2014, but in general, I can see no reason or no evidence pointing to the fact that any individual journalists or commentators, or certainly no editorial positions of various newspapers, has changed in it. And whilst I know that's the end of the sort of like banging the tartan drum kind of image was played out a little in 2014, um, the only thing I can really comment on that touches on this theme to any degree is occasionally you do see when it's in support of a different kind of theme or agenda, the prospect of Scottish independence can be used for that. For example, you would see it in the immediate aftermath of the Brexit vote and the months and years that went on for that. Newspapers that were against Brexit, like the Guardian or the Independent, would use the fact that polls were showing support for Scottish independence was on the rise, was used to further critique the Tory government and how they weren't understanding the national mood, and by extension mismanaging the Brexit vote. But really, the fact that I don't think anything has changed on a huge level, except beyond the fact that I'm fairly sure that most of the themes which dominated the coverage or dominated how it was framed, like the focal points from 2014, most of them will continue to be so, whether that's the NHS or especially when it comes to the economy. Is if the central argument for a lot of the centre right newspapers in 2014 was that Scotland couldn't afford to be independent, and they managed to convince a lot of people of that that was the case. That argument is now infinitely easier to present because the UK as a whole is in far greater financial and economic peril as a result of Brexit and as a result of the expenditure on the coronavirus pandemic. So unfortunately, I can't really see the script changing all that much for either on an individual level or at the level of like specific titles.
Yeah, I think there's definitely kind of work to do on building sort of confidence and building a kind of competency and general understanding about things like a currency. How can Scotland and the I like the idea of having dual currencies where we can use the pound, but we can also start to have our own currency because we're going to need that in order to join the EU. So I think it's kind of a long, Sturgeon forced to play the long game. I think it's a long game anyway, because building a kind of thriving country is not something that you can do overnight. And I think obviously it's really frustrating that at the moment the UK government is effectively making Scotland poorer, so it's strengthening its own argument
Mm.
by Brexit damaging, absolutely, really damaging the Scottish economy. Of course, COVID is damaging it anyway, but creating that damage is actually making Scotland poorer. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I know a lot of people who watch the show would think that 7 years is long enough. So when we're talking about a long game, I think it is important to realise that we've already have 7 years and things have got considerably worse than where you were in 2014. So I know for a lot of people who are watching, the idea that there's more years to this will be very downheartening. Okay, next up, David, you had a Scottish-focused news story. Can you see that there? Scotland on 24-hour notice for lockdown?
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, that one just jumped out at me more because, again, as I thought, like a lot of people, I think, feel it had almost been lulled into a sense that like the worst of these kind of things were past it, and we wouldn't have to be enduring these kind of headlines that like another lockdown's just around the corner or whatnot. And I just wanted to bring that up more because I think, like most people, most people who are perhaps listening to this, or most people in general, the prospect, especially in the winter months, can be incredibly damaging to people. It can affect their mental health, and it can affect them psychologically, and that aspect of having that prospect that could just be dropped at any second is actually, like, I think, can be kind of very damaging. And also think, even though I've been told by several people that Nicola Sturgeon has came across incredibly well in the media, especially in the initial months of the lockdown, the pandemic last year, and conducted herself especially far better than the likes of like Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock ever did. But I think, should she have to navigate and explain another lockdown, especially if it's very strict and especially if it's over the Christmas season, even if it's scientifically or if it's scientifically valid or backed up or supported, it's going to be, just in terms of pure PR, it's not a great thing to be able to try and sell.
I don't think it's going to happen. Personally, I really just don't think that's going to happen. All the evidence coming from South Africa seems to show that, although Omicron is infectious, it's not causing the degree of kind of illness and death that Delta did. And that's what viruses are supposed to do. I mean, I guess I'm naturally an optimist. I could be wrong. I mean, I've been wrong before. But, viruses are supposed to get less fatal. But I think the problem is really that the NHS is kind of in a state of collapse. And I'm sorry to bang on about Brexit, but one of the reasons for that is definitely Brexit, because they lost about 6% of their staff, and also, and this is also to do with COVID, because a lot of people retired, but the building brick of the whole NHS is people providing care in the home, and because they don't have those people, there's like twice as many people in hospital who don't need to be there because they can't go into care homes or any other sort of form of care. So that is actually one of the major reasons that there's queues outside the hospital of ambulances. It's because there's hundreds of folk in the hospital who shouldn't be there. So and I know the government is working on that, but you can't magic up human resources overnight.
Yeah.
And
I,
it's
I
a
know
very
that's
intractable problem.
that comes through in a lot of the pieces that you write. This is that Brexit is rarely mentioned when we're looking at the underlying reasons for the problems that we're having. I wanted to pick up on the next one you had, Jackie, which was Andrew Bailey. So it was Martin van der Weyer. And the headlines:
Yes.
Andrew Bailey has been a bitter disappointment. Do you want to tell us first, for people who don't know who Andrew Bailey is?
Well, hang on. I think that's a good one. But could we just, before that, could we talk about the Basque one? Because the reason for that is because we were doing the international stuff, and I wanted to, when we were talking about, Scotland becoming independent and building a stronger economy, the Basque one really fits into that, because it's a kind of article about how the Basque region of Spain has recovered much better than a lot of other areas of Spain from the economic crash, and that they have had a lot more autonomy than Scotland has, really. They have a lot more tax raising powers. They have a lot more economic levers, although they're still part of Spain,
Yeah.
and that's really helped them. And also, they have been able to work quite effectively with the private sector. And I think we need to do that in Scotland. I mean, Scotland had this reputation for years of being, a nation of quite sort of energetic entrepreneurial types, and I think we need to kind of find that again, because we do need to building a strong economy is an important part of building an independent country where we can give people the kind of prosperous and sort of secure futures that we want. So I was
Yeah.
really interested to read about how effective the Basque region. It has the advantage of being right in the center of Europe, and being at the periphery causes challenges of itself, which is why the EU tends to give structural funds and extra money to the periphery, which Scotland again has lost. I think
Yeah. Well, what
we were
we'll do with all of the
promised.
stories.
Ireland got €1 billion to mitigate the effects of Brexit. Scotland's got 1.7 million from the UK government, so it's
Yeah.
that's no parity.
We'll,
But anyway, I thought
we'll put
the
a
Basque.
link.
It's really
Yeah.
interesting about the
We'll,
Basque country.
we'll put a link to all of the stories, and I definitely think the one that, because this was Martin Wolf in the FT who wrote this story, and a lot of people are saying it can be construed as support for Scottish independence. With any article, you can see what's in it depending on what you're looking for. But I do think it's quite a good one to look at. Obviously, as you both know, I live in Spain, so I've got a slightly different perspective on the Basque region. But certainly, in terms of Basque to Scotland, it's a much more it's closer to an independent country than Scotland is, and it has the most powerful devolved government in. It's certainly much more powerful than the Scottish government. But Spain as a whole is much better regionally. I've just been to Valencia for a few days, and Valencia has this arts and science park, which is just, if you've never seen it, it's just absolutely incredible. Well, you actually probably have seen it if you've watched any sci-fi film over the last 10 or 15 years, because it's always in it. But it is this a huge, couple of mile long park. It's incredible. And there's only 700,000 people in Valencia. So it's actually smaller than Sheffield. And it's a third of the size of Manchester, but it has this huge arts and science centre. And I think Spain, actual regional development has been so much better than what's happened in the United Kingdom. And despite Madrid being this huge city that all the trains go to and has the focus, the actual regional development, when you look at Barcelona and the Basque region, and also in Valencia, it's much more spread out. And I certainly think the UK could learn a lot from how
Well, it's really
Spain.
interesting because the writer of the article sort of concluded that one of the big reasons for the Basque success was that they were able to be bold and make bold choices because they had that autonomy within Spain. And I think we have people within the Scottish government who would like to be bolder about choices and decisions, but they just have such tiny limited powers in terms of tax, in terms of immigration, so much. So there are no powers coming their way from this UK government, and I think if the UK government was serious about trying to kind of keep the UK together, then they would be being a lot bolder than they are. But they have no strategy. Their only strategy is to just kick it in the long grass and hope it goes away. That is their strategy.
Well, I think we'll move on. My final point to say is that the Basque region are still not currency issuers. They're still user of the euro, so they're still weakened they don't have the ability to effectively print money to bring resources in their society
I
into
don't
line.
personally agree with that theory that you can print money and that you won't cause inflation. I personally think it's kind of nonsense.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Being part of the EU, the reason Scotland
we'll
needs its
agree to
own
disagree there,
currency.
Jackie. But it's
Yeah,
certainly
yeah.
not
I mean, it's
nonsense,
just
that
like
theory. It's an
it just
alternative theory. Well, let's talk about the Bank of England then. The article around
okay.
Andrew
So I
Bailey,
think
and
currencies
then
are
we'll bring
really
you in, David.
interesting, and it is really important because I think for a lot of people who are aware of Scots history, when you talk about the Scots pound, it immediately reminds us that the Scots pound historically was worth 1/5 of an English pound. Famously, a Scots mile was 5 times as long as an English mile, and a Scots pound was. So Scottish people were poorer. If you went to London with your currency, it didn't go as far. And I think that was the danger that I felt when Greece was talking about coming out of the EU and coming out of the euro. The danger that they would have had would be that their currency wasn't valuable. They would have lost freedom of movement, and their currency would have been less valuable. And it's going to be tragic to live in a country where the currency
Yeah.
is like
And
failing. So I think that's something you have to think about.
Jackie, was that what was covered in the article about Andrew Bailey, or was that
No,
something
no,
different?
that's a digression. The Andrew Bailey article was quite interesting. I shared it because it was in the Spectator, and I was just interested that obviously the Spectator is a very right wing magazine, and they just had a massive go at Andrew Bailey and basically said he was a disappointment. He was a good middle manager. He should never have been promoted to his current role. He was appointed in part because of his Brexity ideas.
I think we'll just have to.
But
I don't know if we
he's
said that he's the governor of the Bank of England.
he's
I
the
don't know if
governor
we,
of the Bank of
yeah,
England.
yeah.
And he followed Mark Carney, who was regarded as having been rather good, the Canadian. But he had a bit of a he sort of indicated that the Bank of England was going to raise interest rates, but then they didn't, and the market was upset by the fact that they hadn't been given good communication. And it's a judgment call about whether the current inflationary pressures are temporary or not. They may be temporary.
Okay, great. So a right wing newspaper, not too happy about the governor of the Bank of England. That's an interesting perspective there.
Well, it is interesting because I think Sterling's
Jackie,
lost
sorry, we'll just need
20%
to
of its
move on
volume.
because we're struggling a little bit for time. So we've got David. We've got one of your ones, which I think is just from the tail end of last week around the party. Do you want to? Will we go on to the next one, or have you got anything to say on that one?
No, just briefly, the only thing I would say is the fact that this to me just seems like a sort of really mundane and like mediocre cherry on this cake is because at what point, as we were all talking about this at the start of the show, like at what point is it that this government gets held to account? And watching not just the Conservative government, but Boris Johnson in particular, is it's almost taken on the apparent look or feel of a completely like ongoing improvised national version of the thick of it. Because some of the stuff that they put out is so it's so off message, or it's so lacking in self awareness that it almost borders on satire or parody. If it's not, if it's not being caught, with your hand in the till, it's being caught lying. If it's not being caught lying, it's being caught doing X, Y, and Z. To the point where you wonder, you wonder is what is the actual line? And when earlier on Jackie said that sort of democracy in a lot of ways was broken here, or it's at the very least it's hugely weakened. Especially when you look at our Prime Minister, you can't come to any other conclusion but say that that's unfortunately probably right.
Well, what are the consequences of someone lying to Parliament? What are the consequences for democracy? There seem to be no real sanctions. There's not another election for 2 years. In that 2 years, they can do a hell of a lot more damage. The police bill, the other article I want to talk about was the police bill, which really takes away a lot of powers people take for granted. The bill about refugees and asylum seekers. But I think
I think we've covered the. I think we've covered the
lie.
point about the democracy. Definitely, and it's a huge concern if we're expecting the newspapers to hold the government to account. There's very little evidence of that. David, we've got another one here from you, which is Sturgeon makes home working plea as Omicron cases spread.
Well, because I think we've already sort of discussed, the fact, if there is, another lockdown, or at the very least we might have to bring in return to some more stringent measures. It might have an impact on people, but I think we've already covered that, William. So I'll not waste your time babbling on about it.
Okay, great. And Jackie, you had one more, which was if we just want to finish on, I think your article around the police bill.
Yeah, so Camilla Cavendish, who's a commentator in the FT, wrote this piece basically saying that that it's oppressive and authoritarian. And that's not coming from me. That's coming from a writer in the FT. So the police bill was 18 pages were added after it was discussed in Parliament. So she's kind of talking about power drifting away from Parliament. So one expands police power to stop and search people without suspicion. One allows them to stop demonstrators blocking major transport routes. Another bans named individuals from protesting if they have previously committed a protest-related offence. So you won't be allowed to go in a protest if the government names you. They want the police to be able to arrest, fine, and imprison any demonstrator if their protest is noisy enough to cause serious unease to bystanders. So it's just people were arrested. People have been arrested for protesting against this bill, and if the bill goes through, I think we'll all realize, too late, that we're no longer allowed to protest, or that it becomes too scary. You have to take too many risks to do it. So I am very worried about that, and I was very interested to see that there are some people who are kind of talking about it, but very few journalists are talking about it. You see occasionally George Monbiot or somebody writes about it, but I'm not seeing it being covered very
Yeah,
much.
that's an interesting point. And David, do you think the specific difference between Scotland and the United Kingdom has been covered? If someone's covering it, because it'd be very easy to see, and this is not happening in Scotland or the devolved governments. This is something that the English government is doing to anyone who operates in England. Do you think that difference is worth highlighting, or even if this has been covered at all?
Oh no, as you said, in the rare instances where it is highlighted, it's more than certainly worth discussing. But you yourself touched on this earlier, William, and you almost sort of answered your own question, is that given that the majority of the press in Scotland is um, centre right or unionist, or at the very, very, very least, probably anti-independence, is a story like that, which in some fashion can be framed to show that things can be done differently in Scotland, and this trudge towards some sort of like Orwellian nightmare in England might be at least put off in Scotland for a few years yet. But again, that's not going to happen because, and especially across the board in the newspaper industry, because that would be something which promotes Scotland and makes the case against the United Kingdom. And essentially, as an editorial rule, that simply doesn't happen.
And also, I think it may have. I mean, some of the provisions already apply to Scotland, but we've seen that the government are already undermining the devolution settlement, and we don't know how far that's going to go.
Mm.
Okay, well, let's leave on that very optimistic note from you there, Jackie. Thanks very much.
Sorry. Yeah.
It's been really good. I think it's been really difficult for both of you because the last few weeks so much has happened. And the one point I wanted to comment on was that I think that having someone like Boris Johnson with these kind of like bombs going off every couple of minutes really detracts from some other really important issues, like what happened in Afghanistan, like what's happening with the bill that's affecting immigration as well as what's happening on people protesting. And I don't know if this is just an accident or if this is by design, but I think it means that shows like this are even more important when we're talking about the stories that not a lot of people are focusing on. So I really want to thank you both for joining us on the first show, and hopefully at some point next year we'll have you back on and maybe some brighter stories to talk about. But
Maybe
thanks so much for both of you.
About a discussion about the currency, because I do think we need to I want to understand more about that, and I think
Brilliant. Well, I'll do a
really
little.
subject.
I'll do a little a little trailer for Scotonomics, and you can watch a few of the episodes, and you'll understand a lot more about the currency. But thanks very much for both of you joining us tonight.
Thanks, William.
Well, I really hope you enjoyed our first show. We're looking to do this every month, and to do that, we really need your support, not just in commenting and watching and sharing, but also by, if you can afford it, donating whatever you can to Independence Live to help us keep doing more of these shows and a lot more things that we've got planned for next year. But from me this evening, thanks for joining us, and see you again soon. Bye now.